I'm thrilled to be here with you, Jeff. I love your work, as I told you, um, and uh, and I'm also excited to be able to do this event with the Boulder Bookstore, which I've actually been to, and I think my one trip in Boulder, so I can visualize it. And I think I need to begin by saying that, Jeff, this wonderful novel, it there was a sort of I had a spookiness in my experience of reading it, because apart from the spookiness of the plot, which I'll say,
Yeah.
just to set up the story, it begins with a hummingbird, a taxidermy hummingbird appearing in the main character's life, and thrusts her into this wild mystery plot. And as I was reading the book, and I've never seen a hummingbird in New Orleans. I've lived here for about 11 years.
Yeah.
Uh, I woke up one morning after 4 days of rain, and there was a hummingbird right outside of our
Oh
window.
my God.
Uh, at the jasmine, there's some jasmine on the
Oh
neighbor's
yeah.
fence, and it was going, and I was really shocked, and I felt like you'd sort of beamed, manifested it into my life. And then we opened it had rained for 4 days. We opened the back door, and a couple hours later, I saw the hummingbird again, but it
Wow.
was at the
Okay.
window, and then I realized it
Huh.
was inside the house.
Oh
And it
gosh.
had
Oh
come into the
gosh.
house, and then
Oh my
I then
gosh.
proceeded
Oh
this
no.
frantic, terrifying, 20 minutes of trying to rescue it, but it kept going. There's like stairwell, and it kind of went up into the
Uh-huh.
stairwell, refused to go out the open windows, but
Oh no.
finally it
It's
did. And
oh gosh, that's just horrifying. I don't know what I'd do here if I had a hummingbird. I thought you were going to say a salamander walked in the door.
I'm sure that's next. Yeah.
I
I,
actually saw a hummingbird on the day that the novel was published out at the St. Mark's Wildlife Refuge, where I've never seen one, which was a little bit weird. You don't want to take it as like a sign; it's just chance.
yeah,
But
I
why
can't
have you
tell if
not
that's
seen
a
a
night.
hummingbird? Is it? I mean, it seems like you would have possibly seen one there, or is it
I,
just?
well, I think it gets to something that you write about, which is, you sort of maybe it's that you don't have your eyes
Mm,
open to some of these things until, and once your eyes are open to it, as mine were, to the glory of hummingbirds by this book, I saw it vividly, right in front of me, and in fact in my own house. But I feel that we should begin by just um, explaining. I'm very wary of drifting too far into plots, because I know
mhm.
how people feel about spoilers. So I would never want to go too close to that. But I guess I would say that it's a mystery setup, and the main character, who's Jane, or alternately Jill at different points, is pulled into a kind of environmental thriller, I guess, would be the simplest, most the crudest way of putting it. But
Yeah.
there's habitat restoration, there's evil multinationals, there's taxidermy, as weaponized taxidermy. How I'll let you decide how far you want to go down the plot line. Yeah.
Well, I think that the main thing for me is that even though it's not visible to Jane right away, is just the act of taking this hummingbird is almost like taking it off like a weighted pedestal where there's a trap. Because as soon as she does that, more or less, it kind of sounds an alarm bell, and various third parties are kind of after her for various reasons. Some of them actually kind of irrational when you think about it, but that's kind of the way I feel the world works. And she has her own kind of history that she has to deal with, but at the same time, what she really comes face to face with is the history of the people surrounding this dead eco terrorist or eco activist Sylvina, who has gifted her with this strange gift. And this is a woman that Jane doesn't know. And I think exacerbating things are the fact that Jane's a security analyst, which I think makes her feel a little more impervious to the effect of investigating than a non-expert would. And this is something I also find, especially when I had a day job, that the experts often misjudge the risk of the things they were doing because they were experts. And then from there, I think she begins to inhabit her own kind of myth or mythos of detective work, which is something that she had wanted to do. And one thing about the novel that I that I thought would be interesting is that she's writing this from a certain point in time where she's looking back. So she's kind of haunting and riddling through the present day of the novel with the ghosts of what's going to happen. And so that kind of destabilizes the thriller stuff. It kind of adds, I think, like I said, this kind of haunting of the narrative by her future self who knows more.
Yeah, I find that really effective. There's a tension that there's a sense that in the narration, um, uh, that bad things are going to happen, of course, and that wild, unexpected things are going to happen, and I wondered if you could one of the things that you do so well in fiction that feels somewhat unusual for a male novelist is you have all of these great heroines in your fiction, and uh, I can think of many male novelists who sort of maybe try it on for one book,
Mhm.
but you have all of these, and I wondered if how you came to writing Jane, if you could talk about, and she's also just this fascinating
Mhm.
character, sort of physically imposing,
Mhm.
shrewd, and yet has some major blind spots. I mean, the only
Mhm.
and a detective type character, the only character that I feel that I've come across in fiction like her at all is from a relatively lesser known Martin Amis novel, Night Train, where there's a detective,
Hmm.
Mike Houlihan, who's a
Huh.
female, hard-boiled female
Huh.
detective. But but different in a lot of ways
Mhm.
from Jane. So how did you come to this character? Was the gender aspect of it significant to you, or did it just sort of feel that inevitable in some ways? And
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's always like a combination of different impulses. I think also that although I've been writing women characters before Annihilation, the fact that that novel did so well and that I received kind of affirmation for doing it, and a lot of people respond to that character. It's the kind of thing that my subconscious responds to, and so kind of in a very organic way, I think that comes out more and more. But here I had this initial image of this very tiny bit of taxidermy in this very large hand, and when my imagination kind of in this initial vision panned back, it was a woman who was a former weightlifter, former wrestler, and so that aspect, I don't know where it came from exactly, except I loved the fact that there was a certain physicality to this woman. And one of the earliest scenes I wrote, which wasn't working for the longest time, was a scene where she's being kind of stalked up a hill after she's found something that's important to Sylvina. And it wasn't until I realized that even though it would still be a risk, that she's actually going to she's just kind of irritated with the fact that the guy behind her she thinks she could actually take, and so she does. She just hauls off and hits him, turns around and does that. And as soon as that happened, then I had some insight, because I also thought that's not necessarily what anyone with that physicality would do either. So that was something very specific to Jane. Then on the other hand, I've always been fascinated by the fact that my wife, who is very unlike Jane in so many ways, but who I do dedicate all my novels to because I do tend to talk to her about them in progress. Um, it always fascinated me that she wanted to be a homicide detective in Miami, and then she took mathematics and statistics courses in aid of that, and wound up being a software programmer and a software manager in a field that was heavily male dominated. And so a lot of the stuff that comes with the security analyst stuff is kind of like taking it to one remove, but then using things that Anne has told me about working in a workplace like that and applying them to Jane's character. So there's that. There's the fact that I'm not I can't jog or do things like that for any reasonable amount of time. I can hike and I can lift weights, and those are the only two things that I've ever done with any consistency. So I knew that I at least knew the gym atmosphere and knew it would be different for Jane, but also knew that I at least had that framework of like an in to thinking about the physicality.
Sylvina is also,
Mm.
although she's not really physically present in the book, is sort of the other side of the story, and she's there. It feels like on almost
Mhm.
her presence is there
Yeah.
on almost every page. She's
Yeah.
this woman who we are told at the beginning is dead, and so she's not even alive, and yet she's being tracked, and we're in the process, we're learning about, not only who she was and what she did, but her interior life too, through these journals, which is also reminds me of in Annihilation. There's a similar thing going on, and I wondered if, I mean, this is such, I hate asking this question because
No, feel
it's
free.
the most boring fiction question to ask, but it does feel like it's such the fascinating story of this woman who's like essentially the heiress of this corrupt multinational corporation who turns on the corporation. Is there, did you have any analog in mind, any real world analog in mind, as you were writing that, or that gave you the impetus for that?
I think the thing that has fascinated me just in terms of like multinational corporations is how it's almost impossible to get too broad in describing them these days. And I know this from, without going into detail, day jobs where I had to deal with founders of companies like that. And it was amazing to me just how caricature like they could become. Even to the point where there's a character named Lowry that's in the Southern Reach series who's fairly over the top, but which I think ever since Trump we kind of realized is not over the top, and he was based on someone that I met a few times in that context. So there was that, and then there was just I don't know. I mean, there's again different impulses. Like Silvina, one way I came to Argentine history was actually through the literary journal Sur, which was co-edited by Silvina Ocampo. So the name is just a very light allusion or name check, or just like that's what my entry point was. And then also I minored in Latin American history in college, and so I was also thinking about some of the things that I learned there. Uh, about industrialists and whatnot from that region. And then Silvina herself, the entry point for me personally was that I do have a sensitivity to light and to sound, and and so I thought that would be interesting if that's something that was amplified in her in such a way that it kind of jump started her activism as much as her upbringing.
And then the other thing that struck me about this book in the context of your career is that it's, you've written mystery plots and sort of hard-boiled detective plots before, but this seems that, is it safe to say that this is the most realistic world that you've taken on? I mean, it's it's not really, fantastical, or we're not in science fiction. It's sort of deeply realistic, and in fact, it's, we even have a pandemic is sort of along the fringes of the
Yeah.
narrative. Um, and I guess it ultimately might go a little bit into the
Mhm.
future, but it's essentially the world that we're living in now. And I
Yeah.
wondered whether that, how much was that, was that a conscious decision? And but also is the, I wonder, with writing about these issues of sort of environmental, collapse and climate change, and that whether the dread and the horror and the sort of otherworldliness, really, of
Mhm.
what we're experiencing now, at
Mhm.
least the sensation that we feel, does that make it, s- the sort of fantastical lens, does that become redundant in a way, that we're already in this fantastical moment now, that
Yeah, no, I mean, I do think it does because at the same time, my last novel was kind of a phantasmagorical prose poem, Dead Astronauts, that was kind of like dealing with environmental issues in a totally different way. So I don't know, like I don't think I'm going to necessarily do realism per se all the time now, but it did feel like a moment where this the science fictional elements were no longer science fictional, and that novels were becoming science fiction novels of the near future were becoming just failed novels about the present day because they got some of the details wrong when reality caught up. Um, I don't mean that in a bad way. It's a fool's game to try to be predictive when it comes to speculative fiction, anyway. So yeah, so there is that. At the same time, the Southern Reach trilogy, there's large sections of it that, especially like in Authority, that are analyzing bureaucratic stupidity, giving you a view of a small southern town. So in terms of like the discrete units in which something is built, I've written plenty of mundane scenes in which people are just talking to each other. So in that way, it didn't really feel that different. But it did feel different to not be kind of necessarily including a speculative element without giving too much away. And I think the weirdness resides somewhere else, kind of in the absurdity and irrationality of human beings. But
Yeah,
also the flying bear exists and born in a world that's very carefully charted in terms of issues of scarcity and supply and demand. So the economics of Bourne, besides the flying bear, kind of work a little bit. It's
right.
it's weird, yeah.
Well, it seems to be like the more the more speculative, or sort of the more fantastical the world, the more rigid you have to be
Mm.
with the internal rules, right, of the
True,
world.
true, absolutely.
There's this one I f- there's this fascinating theme that I sort of alluded to earlier that I'd like to, if it's not embarrassing, can I read a short
Yeah, no, I
section, or
actually, I mean, it's quite
unless
fascinating
you'd
to me when
prefer
people.
to read
No, no,
okay.
I'm very lazy. I really much prefer this. It's,
Because I felt that it captured this theme that I think is central to this book, but that I think recurs in your work. So I'll just read it, uh, and I let me make sure. I don't think it's giving anything away. No. Over time, this is the narrator, Jane, talking. Over time, I would see also the complexity of what we took for granted in our landscapes, and hidden lines of connection would attach to me until moving through the world was like being wrapped in chains. But it was the links, the chains that made you free. Once you saw it all, you could never go back. Everything was alive, overwhelming. I was overwhelmed eventually, overcome. Sylvina wrote that even through the poisoned landscape, we must love it. We must love what has been damaged because everything has been damaged. And to love the damage is to know you care about that world, that you're still alive, that the world is alive. How did I not see the damage for so long? And it's a moving scene, and the damage she's alluding to is, I guess, that could be defined in different ways, but I read it as just ecological damage,
yeah,
essentially. I mean,
yeah.
you could apply it more specifically within the context of the plot, but um, and I feel like it this sort of that it's almost like the what's the metaphor, like once you're able to see it, you can't unsee it, and I feel that all of us, or any of us who pays it any of us who pays attention to the world, or reads headlines even,
Mhm.
has a moment when we're forced to confront the reality of what we're in, what we're up against, this complete reconfiguration of the natural world, and all of the damage that we've caused and all the peril that we're in now. And there's something really shattering about that moment of recognition, and you can't stop seeing it. And what you do with that knowledge, it depends on the individual. I mean, not everyone becomes a Greenpeace activist, but I think it still changes how you see the world. I mean, this is something that I've been trying to write about, and I wondered if you uh, I mean, I guess I'd just be curious your response to this idea. I mean, that I feel like it's been there in your writing before this, but it's really powerful in this novel. This switch that turns on, and then everything is different.
Yeah, no, I mean, I talked earlier about what's personal in the character, and one thing I channeled, even though I was, I think, farther along on like the awareness levels than Jane is at the beginning of this novel, is that when we moved into this new house, and there was this trough of woodlands behind it in this little ravine, I really came to know a lot more about native plants and everything else. But at the same time, I was much more aware of the damage coming from the top of the hill, literally, because this is a slanted ravine where people are using chemicals and stuff at the top, where I can be gardening and I can find alternately a rusted figure skate and a barrel of garbage, and from the outset it looks fairly pristine and everything, but it's got all this other stuff going on. And this is something that, I knew intellectually before, but I had never tried to like reestablish at least a better working ecosystem, not a perfect or really complex one, but just something that was better than what was there. And I think that that's what really made the invisible things visible to me. So when I wrote that part, I was actually also talking about myself, and also talking about the regret of living for so long and not seeing some of these things, and wanting to kind of make up for that, and thinking that that's one area where I could share something with Jane that was for me, that would make sense for her in terms of her exploration with Sylvina. At the same time, there's this issue of like, how do you broadcast a message? And a lot of people that I talk to, who want to, do better for the environment, I don't know that they always respond to the idea of a broken landscape. Like, to them, and to a lot of people still, if they go to St. Mark's Wildlife Refuge, they're not going to see necessarily even like the human intercession with the levees and whatnot that are out there. They're still going to see that as a wilderness, and the city is not a wilderness. So sometimes in terms of the like nonfiction messaging, I'm always torn on like how to present it, because there is something still appealing about the idea of something that's not messed with by human beings. Or I think on the sliding scale, it's just simply that there are things that are less messed with, or seemingly less messed with, in negative ways, that we think of as wilderness now. So I go back and forth on how to present that, even outside of fiction. And of course, the novel is like presenting all kinds of things throughout the entire course of it, some of which I agree with and some of which I don't.